A thick layer of gray clouds hung low over downtown Brookford, muting the afternoon light and casting the streets in a dull silver tone. The air smelled faintly of rain on hot asphalt, a storm threatening somewhere just beyond the horizon. Malcolm Reed stood near the entrance of the Brookford Municipal Building, a tall structure of glass and stone that reflected the heavy clouds overhead. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, with a crisp white shirt and a slim navy tie. In his hand, he held a leather-bound notebook, the corners slightly worn from years of travel. He glanced at his watch, 2:43 p.m., and then at his phone, scrolling through an email confirming the meeting he was here for. His contact was running a few minutes late, but Malcolm didn't mind. He stood calmly, weight shifted slightly to one side, eyes occasionally lifting to scan the steady flow of pedestrians, cyclists, and delivery trucks. Across the street, a police cruiser rolled into view, the blue and white paint job gleaming faintly even under the overcast sky. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ethan Doyle, a white man in his early 40s with a square jaw and closely cropped hair. His gaze flicked from the road to Malcolm, then back again, then back once more, lingering this time. Doyle slowed the cruiser, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man on the sidewalk. Something about Malcolm's stillness, his quiet composure, made Doyle's attention sharpen. He scanned the block. No one else was lingering. No one else was standing still without moving along. From behind the windshield, Doyle watched as Malcolm tapped something into his phone, looked up at the municipal building, then down again. The officer's hand shifted from the steering wheel to rest on the side of his utility belt, just brushing the leather near his holster. He turned the wheel, pulling the cruiser toward the curb. The tires bumped gently against it as he put the car in park. Malcolm noticed the movement in his peripheral vision, glancing briefly toward the cruiser before returning his eyes to his phone. His expression didn't change, but the faintest crease appeared between his brows. Doyle stepped out of the vehicle, the door shutting with a muted thunk. The weight of his boots carried in a slow, measured rhythm toward the man in the suit. The muted hum of the city, distant car horns, snippets of conversation, the clatter of a delivery dolly on the sidewalk, seemed to recede just slightly as the two men's paths converged. By the time Doyle stopped in front of him, Malcolm had slipped the phone into his pocket, meeting the officer's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "Afternoon," Doyle said, his tone carrying a faint edge of authority. "What's your business here?" Malcolm glanced toward the glass doors of the building, then back at the officer. "I'm waiting for someone," he replied evenly. Doyle's gaze swept over him again, his posture tightening. "Can't have people loitering in front of government buildings," he said. The clouds above shifted, and the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the city. The wind picked up, sweeping down the block and rattling a loose metal sign near the bus stop. The muted silver light from the overcast sky flattened the colors of the street, making every movement and expression stand out in sharp contrast. Officer Ethan Doyle took one slow step closer to Malcolm Reed, his hand still resting lightly near his duty belt. "You said you're waiting for someone," Doyle repeated, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that implied suspicion. "That's right," Malcolm replied, his tone even. His dark eyes didn't flinch away from the officer's, but there was no defiance in them, just calm observation, as if he were quietly taking in every detail of this encounter. Doyle glanced up at the municipal building's facade, then back at Malcolm. What's the name of the person you're meeting?" Malcolm's brows ticked up almost imperceptibly. "Why does that matter?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Because this is a government building. We've had incidents before. I need to know you're here for a legitimate reason." "I assure you," Malcolm said, "my reason is legitimate." Doyle shifted his stance, placing himself more squarely in front of Malcolm. "All right then, let's see some ID." Malcolm paused, studying the officer's face for a moment before speaking. "I'm on a public sidewalk. As far as I know, I haven't committed a crime." That answer landed like a small spark in dry grass. Doyle's expression hardened. "If you've got nothing to hide, then it shouldn't be a problem to show some identification." Around them, a pair of pedestrians slowed slightly, sensing the charged air between the two men, before deciding to cross to the other side of the street. The distant hum of traffic seemed to fade, leaving only the clipped rhythm of the conversation. Malcolm kept his voice calm but deliberate. "Officer, I'm waiting for a meeting that was scheduled in advance. My contact is inside, and I expect them any minute." Doyle took a step closer, the leather of his utility belt creaking faintly. "Then you can wait after you've identified yourself. Otherwise, you need to move along." Malcolm's gaze didn't waver, but the muscles in his jaw shifted, a sign of growing frustration. "I'm not obstructing anyone. I'm standing on a public sidewalk where I have every right to be." Doyle's tone cooled further, his voice flattening into something procedural. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. Let me see your ID." Overhead, the clouds darkened a shade deeper, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The space between them felt tighter, as if the whole block was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first. The silence between them stretched, thick and unyielding, broken only by the distant hiss of a bus breaking 2 blocks away. The storm overhead seemed to press lower, the air dense with static. Officer Ethan Doyle took a slow breath through his nose, his gaze locked on Malcolm Reed. The set of Malcolm's shoulders was calm, almost deliberate, but Doyle read it as resistance. "All right," Doyle said, his voice clipped. "Turn around and place your hands on the wall." Malcolm's brow furrowed, a small crease deepening between his eyes. "On what grounds?" "Loitering," Doyle replied without hesitation, "and obstruction for refusing to identify yourself." Malcolm blinked slowly, his jaw tightening. "Loitering? I've been standing here less than 15 minutes, waiting for my—" Doyle cut him off with a raised hand. "Hands! On! The wall!" A couple walking their dogs slowed nearby, their eyes darting between the two men. Another passerby, a man in a blue windbreaker, stopped entirely, phone in hand as if considering whether to start recording. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, the sound measured, controlled. Without another word, he stepped toward the stone facade of the municipal building and placed his palms flat against the cool surface. The sleeves of his suit jacket pulled back slightly, revealing the neat cuffs of his shirt. Doyle moved in, the leather of his belt creaking as he unclipped the handcuffs from their holder. The metal glinted briefly in the muted daylight before he snapped one cuff around Malcolm's right wrist, then the left, the ratcheting clicks sharp in the quiet air. "You're making a mistake," Malcolm said, his tone calm but carrying a weight that made the words feel heavier than they should. "That's for the judge to decide," Doyle muttered, steering him away from the wall toward the waiting cruiser. The bystanders' eyes followed them, some curious, some uneasy. The man in the windbreaker slipped his phone back into his pocket but didn't look away. As Doyle guided Malcolm into the back seat of the cruiser, the first cold drops of rain began to fall, darkening the pavement in uneven patches. The door shut with a heavy thunk, sealing Malcolm inside. Doyle walked around to the driver's side, his jaw set, his mind already moving to the paperwork he'd need to file. He didn't see Malcolm's eyes in the rearview mirror, steady, unblinking, and almost assessing. The Brookford Police Precinct sat like a block of concrete and glass at the corner of 8th and Main, its fluorescent-lit interior a sharp contrast to the dim, rain-streaked streets outside. The cruiser pulled into the Sallyport with a hollow echo, the steel garage door rumbling shut behind them. Officer Ethan Doyle stepped out first, rainwater still speckled across his shoulders, and opened the rear door. "Watch your head," he muttered as Malcolm Reed stepped out. The cuffs still circled Malcolm's wrists, cool and tight against his skin. His movements were unhurried, his eyes taking in every detail. The security cameras mounted high on the walls, the damp smell of concrete, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. Doyle led him through the side entrance into the booking area. A civilian clerk sat behind a thick glass partition, typing steadily, the click of the keyboard blending with the buzz of an aging ceiling fan. Two other officers leaned against the counter, chatting idly, but their conversation stilled as they noticed the man in the suit being led inside in cuffs. "What's the charge?" one of them asked. "Loitering and obstruction," Doyle replied briskly. One of the officers raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His gaze lingered on Malcolm for a moment, as if sensing something unusual about this arrest. At the booking desk, Doyle recited Malcolm's name and basic information while the clerk filled out the arrest record. Malcolm stood silently, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on a spot just above the clerk's shoulder, not avoiding eye contact, but not offering it either. "Empty your pockets," Doyle instructed, unlocking one cuff so Malcolm could comply. Malcolm placed his phone, wallet, and pen on the counter in a slow, deliberate motion. The wallet was black leather, with an understated gold embossing on the corner, letters that caught the eye but meant nothing to Doyle in that moment. Once his belongings were cataloged, the other cuff was removed, and Doyle gestured toward the holding area. The cell was small but clean, with pale blue walls and a bench along one side. Malcolm stepped inside without protest, the door closing with a metallic clang. From behind the bars, he could see most of the booking area. He watched Doyle filling out forms, the lines of concentration on his face deepening. Malcolm's gaze moved to the clock on the wall, 3:18 p.m. His meeting should have started 15 minutes ago. He settled onto the bench, crossing one leg over the other, and rested his hands loosely in his lap. Despite the sterile hum of the station, there was something about him that radiated composure, the kind that unsettled more than any raised voice could. In the far corner, the officer who'd raised an eyebrow earlier was still watching him, a faint crease of curiosity in his forehead. The hum of the booking area was broken by the sharp click of heels on tile. Heads turned as Captain Laura Medina strode in from the main hallway, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, her expression set like carved granite. "Doyle," she called, her voice carrying enough authority to cut through the air like a blade. Officer Ethan Doyle straightened immediately. "Yes, Captain?" Medina stopped in front of him, her dark eyes scanning the clipboard in her hands. "Where's Malcolm Reed?" Doyle glanced toward the holding cell. "Right there. Loitering and obstruction." Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "You arrested him?" "Yes, ma'am." He refused to identify himself, was hanging around outside the municipal building. Medina didn't let him finish. "Unlock that cell. Right now." The room stilled. The two officers leaning at the counter exchanged a quick glance. Doyle frowned, confused. "Captain, Now, Doyle!" Medina's voice cracked like a whip. He moved toward the cell, the keyring jangling in his hand, still not understanding the urgency. The heavy door swung open and Malcolm stepped out with calm precision, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket as if he had simply been waiting for a late appointment. Medina turned to Malcolm, her tone shifting entirely. "Mr. Reed, I'm so sorry. We were expecting you later this afternoon, but I should have made sure everyone was aware you might arrive early." Doyle's gaze snapped between them. "Wait, you know him?" Medina leveled him with a look that could have cut steel. "Of course I know him. Malcolm Reed is a senior federal investigator from the Department of Justice. He's here to conduct an unannounced audit of our department's policies, procedures, and officer conduct." The words hit like a body blow. Doyle felt the heat rising up the back of his neck. Malcolm met Doyle's eyes for the first time since the arrest. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was a sharpness there, like someone filing away a mental note. "I imagine," Malcolm said evenly, "that today's encounter will give me a useful starting point for my review." A faint murmur rippled through the room. One of the younger officers coughed into his fist, hiding a smirk that never reached his eyes. Medina stepped aside to let Malcolm pass. "We'll begin in the conference room," she said. "Unless you'd prefer to start your review here in the booking area." Malcolm gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Here's fine. I've already seen enough to have a few questions." Doyle swallowed hard, his earlier certainty unraveling by the second. The sound of rain pattering against the station's tall windows mixed with the soft squeak of dress shoes on tile as Malcolm Reed moved through the precinct's main corridor. Captain Laura Medina walked at his side, a pen clipped neatly to the corner of her leather portfolio. Behind them, Officer Ethan Doyle followed, his usual confident stride reduced to something more measured, almost hesitant. Every hallway they entered seemed sharper, quieter. Officers glanced up from their desks, their conversations tapering off as they saw the suited man with the captain, and Doyle trailing behind like a shadow. Malcolm carried no visible notepad, but his eyes missed nothing. He paused at a bulletin board, cluttered with outdated memos and faded community outreach flyers. "How often is this updated?" he asked without looking back. "Monthly," Doyle said quickly. "Bi-monthly," Medina corrected, flipping through the papers. "Though I can see some of these are over 3 months old." Malcolm nodded slightly, his gaze lingering on a flyer about use of force policy training dated from the previous year. They moved toward the evidence room. Malcolm stopped at the reinforced door, his eyes on the digital log sheet mounted beside it. "Access control," he said. "Who reviews these logs?" "The evidence sergeant," Doyle replied. "And who audits the sergeant's reviews?" Malcolm asked. Doyle hesitated. "The captain does." Malcolm finally turned his head, meeting Doyle's eyes with a faint, unreadable expression. "Checks and balances work best when they're not vertical," he said. "You'll want to ensure cross-level oversight." From there, they entered the briefing room. Rows of chairs faced a whiteboard, scribbled with call assignments and shift notes. Malcolm scanned the board, reading every line. "Response times for the East Sector seem higher than average. Any reason?" Doyle shifted his weight. "Higher call volume," he offered. "Or resource misallocation," Malcolm said evenly. "I'll need your last 3 months of dispatch logs." It was subtle, but Doyle's jaw tightened. They passed through the locker rooms, the dispatch center, even the break room. Malcolm asked questions in the same measured tone, never raising his voice, never rushing, but each one carrying the quiet precision of someone who already suspected the answers. By the time they looped back toward the booking area, Doyle felt the weight of every step. This was no routine inspection. It was a dissection, and every decision he'd made in the last hour was under the microscope. At the threshold of the holding cells, Malcolm stopped, turning fully toward Doyle for the first time since the revelation in Chapter 5. "This," Malcolm said, gesturing toward the row of cells, "is where an officer's judgment is most visible. The choice to place someone here speaks volumes about your department's values." He didn't raise his voice, but the words landed with a density Doyle could feel in his chest. By late afternoon, the rain had slowed to a fine mist, streaking the tall windows of the precinct with silver lines. Inside the conference room, a single overhead light cast a focused pool of brightness onto the long wooden table. Malcolm Reed sat at the head, a slim laptop open in front of him. His fingers moved quietly over the keys, the soft tap-tap filling the otherwise still air. Captain Laura Medina sat 2 seats down, reviewing her own notes, the edge of her pen tapping lightly against the folder in front of her. At the far end of the table, Officer Ethan Doyle sat with his back straight, hands folded on the tabletop. He hadn't been told to stay, but Medina had asked him to remain available for questions. That phrase alone kept his nerves taut. Every so often, Malcolm would glance at him, not for long, but long enough for Doyle to feel the weight of the look. It wasn't the glare of someone out for revenge. It was something heavier, measured, evaluative. Finally, Malcolm closed his laptop with a soft click. "That will be all for today," he said to Medina, his tone neutral. Then he turned to Doyle. "Officer, I'll be including today's incident in my report. Not as a disciplinary recommendation, that's not my role, but as a case study in discretionary authority and bias in initial engagement." Doyle swallowed, his throat tight. "Understood." Malcolm stood, slipping the laptop into his leather portfolio. "The badge," he said, "isn't just permission to enforce the law. It's a responsibility to see people as they are, not as you expect them to be. The difference between the two can decide whether your actions build trust or tear it apart." The words hung in the room for a moment before Malcolm stepped out into the hallway, Medina following close behind. Doyle remained at the table, staring at the faint reflection of the ceiling light on the polished wood. His mind replayed the afternoon, the narrowing eyes when he first saw Malcolm, the snap of the cuffs, the confused walk into the precinct. Every detail now carried a different weight. Through the glass wall of the conference room, Doyle could see Malcolm leaving the building, his figure cutting a calm, steady path through the misting rain toward a waiting black sedan. Doyle exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He had written 100 reports in his career, but this, whatever Malcolm was going to write, would be the one that lingered. Not because of what it might say about the department, but because of what it had already said about him.